Hello, good evening. I'm excited to be here tonight with my longtime friend and colleague, Jeremy Everett. As Dr. Paul introduced him, he's the executive director of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty out of Waco, Texas. Jeremy and I were classmates in college at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama, where we were both religion majors. We were friends and we were activists even then. I remember going with him and a few friends weekly to the Firehouse Mission, and we would sort donated clothes, and we'd bring coats we had collected from our friends on campus. And then 20 years later, our paths crossed on the issues of hunger and food security. And it turned out that we had both pursued careers in uplifting and advocating for vulnerable populations living in poverty at home and around the world. Before we start talking about the issues of hunger and malnutrition, I want to review the facts and where we are today. So first, the world has come together with some agreed upon goals called the Sustainable Development Goals. And I just wanted to highlight that the second goal is, in fact, to end hunger, to end all forms of hunger and malnutrition by 2030, making sure all people, especially children and the most vulnerable, have access to sufficient and nutritious food all year round. So what does ending hunger look like? Globally and very specifically, it means improving the livelihoods and capacities of small-scale farmers, allowing equal access to land, technology, and markets, ensuring international cooperation of investment in infrastructure and technology to improve agricultural productivity, and finally promoting integrated approaches for alleviating child hunger and undernutrition. But let's talk about the good news. The good news is that, did you know that since 1990, as a global community with the U.S. leading in funding for global health and development in developing nations, we have cut in half the number of people living in extreme poverty. We've also cut the number of people living with hunger in half, from 23.3% in 1990 to 12.9% today. I've shown this slide here a few years back, but it's a story that bears repeating. We've tackled the low-hanging fruit of work it takes to end hunger, and the good news is that we are halfway there. We can do this, and we know how to do this. However, the bad news is that since 2014, the numbers have slowed and even been on the rise in an upward J-curve, with an increase of people living in poverty and with undernourishment to about 821 million people today. And this has largely been due to famines in conflict nations like Syria, Yemen, Sudan, and Nigeria, the rise in refugee populations, and finally, the growing effects of climate change. Jeremy is an expert on domestic hunger. Tell us what's going on in the U.S. at the same time in terms of food security and hunger issues.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say it's great to be with you. It's an honor to be with so many people who are manifesting Christ's presence to the hungry and poor, both domestically and around the world on a daily basis. Dr. Osteen, thank you for pulling such a great group of people together for us to be able to learn from each other over the next several days. As many of you live in the United States, and so you're traveling back and forth. You're living here, and then you're going and spending time across the pond addressing some global health crises. When you're here, what does domestic hunger and poverty look like? One of the things that we tell our students is that if you ever want to deal with a social issue, you really have to do three things simultaneously. One, you have to have proximity to the problem. As Brian Stevenson said, you can't solve a social problem from a distance. And the second thing is you need to understand what research suggests so that our efforts do more good than harm. And then the third thing is you really need to understand your faith tradition. And certainly that is the rootedness for all of us who are in the room today and the reason why we do what we do. Well, for me, my family and I have lived in low-income communities in and around the country for about 20 years. A story that happened to us about 15 years ago was we lived on San Antonio's West Side community. The neighborhood has about 150,000 residents, another 50,000 undocumented residents. The median income is about $19,000 per household, and typically you had 3 generations sharing a home in our neighborhood. Our best high school had a 50% dropout rate. So we knew that not only do we have poverty today, but we knew that we were creating a lot of poverty for the future. But one of our neighbors was a woman named Lupe, and Lupe was a fierce advocate for education in the community. Her goal for her kids was for them to graduate from high school and hopefully go to San Antonio Community College. But she wasn't just an advocate for her kids, she was an advocate for all the kids in the neighborhood. Well, she would oftentimes, she also was the primary caregiver to her 2 wheelchair-bound parents, and so each day her husband would leave and go off to work. He was the only person on our block that had full-time hours with one employer. But she would then get her parents situated at a senior center, her kids off to school, and then she would make her way to volunteer in the schools so not only that her kids would do well, but all the other kids in the neighborhood would do well as well. And she was a legend in the community. Well, her kids and her family, oftentimes they didn't make enough money to make ends meet, and so it wasn't uncommon for their water to get cut off or their power to get cut off or for their kids to not have any food in the house during the summer months when they were out of school. But Lupe, like all of us, got an ear infection. Only she didn't have health insurance, and so she waited until that ear infection was too painful to bear, and ultimately she decided to catch a bus and go down to one of the emergency rooms in downtown San Antonio, where she waited all day but wasn't seen. She knew she needed to get back home and catch the bus before her kids got out of school so that they wouldn't come home to an empty house. Later that evening, her eardrum ruptured, the infection went into her brain, she fell into a coma, and she never woke up. The next day, her kids and her husband were going door to door in our neighborhood, raising money for a memorial service so that they could bury their mother. Her husband came to my front porch and he just sat on my front porch and he said, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do?" Oftentimes we act as if we have 40 million Americans that are experiencing poverty and another 40 million Americans that are food insecure and another 30 million Americans that don't have health insurance. But the reality is it's the same family on the local level bearing the weight of all of our broken social systems. They're food insecure, they don't have health insurance, and they're underemployed. When I served on a congressional commission, we found that the number one cause for food insecurity in the U.S. was underemployment. Basically, if you're making $7.25 an hour, the federal minimum wage, and you are able to get 40 hours a week, that's still only $13,000 a year. You couldn't possibly afford rent in Houston at $13,000 a year. And so that is the state of the nation. So when you're here, there are ways that we want you to get engaged in addressing hunger and poverty, just like you're doing when you go into a global environment.
Thank you. So when Jeremy and I started working together again, not only did we share the same goals through advocacy, but it became evident in our conversations that we shared the same similar sacred values. To address hunger, we needed the following. We needed collaboration to open doors for everyone to work together. We needed communication to speak multiple languages across political and religious and racial and geographic lines, and we needed commitment to committing our lives to advocate for the poor. In The End of Hunger, which is the book we have here tonight, Renewed Hope for Feeding the World, Jeremy graciously contributed a beautiful chapter on hunger in America from his I Was Hungry book, which was also recent release. I Was Hungry highlights each of these values: collaboration, communication, commitment. And I want to unpack those with Jeremy today. So let's discuss these values and beliefs and the why we are committed to ending hunger. And then let's talk about the how you can play an integral role in the next 10 years to achieve the second of the Sustainable Development Goals to end hunger. So first, let's talk about collaboration. Jeremy, you now run the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. Give us a sense of that collaboration, the organizations involved, and the kind of strategic plans it takes to tackle hunger in Texas, which is a model for other states and perhaps even countries around the world.
You know, a lot of our work is in research and innovation. So we have 60 researchers and 40 or 50 field staff who are implementing work and working with researchers in real time. But ultimately, what makes this issue accessible is that many of us have either volunteered in a food pantry or we've sent our kids to school where they might have school breakfast and school lunch and different things. And But these issues are too big for any one organization or one person or even one sector to address by themselves. So it requires all of us, all hands on deck, if we ultimately want to end hunger in our lifetime. So when we were initially launched our project called the Texas Hunger Initiative a little over 10 years ago, we had pilot communities around the state of Texas that were trying a collaborative-based model we call hunger-free communities. And we got a phone call from two women from San Angelo, Texas, who called me and they said, Jeremy, we need to be one of the pilot communities for the Texas Hunger Initiative because we have 3 manufacturing plants that just closed, and we now have 10,000 kids on our free and reduced lunch program. Well, I told the women, I said, I'm sorry, but we've already identified our pilot communities. Maybe call us back next year. Well, I don't know if you've met anybody from West Texas, but they don't take no for an answer very easily. And so I told them, after we talked for a little while, they said, well, Jeremy, I don't think you heard us. And so they just spoke a little louder with a little more hostility and repeated the same story. So I told them about our community assessment tool, and I asked them to go do it. Typically, it takes a community 9 months, and I thought maybe by the time they complete it, we'll be ready to take them on as a pilot community. Well, they called me back 3 weeks later, and they had completed the community assessment. They had their mayor, their congressman, their city council, their school board and school superintendent, nonprofits and church leaders and pastors, all ready to go, ready to collaborate to address summer hunger for the kids in their community who are about to get out of school, who've been directly impacted by this manufacturing crisis. So we went out there and launched, we launched this pilot community. And just within a few months worth of planning, the churches said, hey, we've got commercial kitchens, we'll make meals. And the nonprofits in the community park said, well, we're located in low-income neighborhoods, so we'll be summer meal sites. And the business community and the elected officials said, well, we'll pick up the food and we'll take it directly to the summer meal site so we can keep the kids' minds and bodies physically engaged so that they start the next school year off well. In just a few months worth of planning, in this small West Texas town, they served 20,000 meals to kids who previously wouldn't have gotten a meal without their input. A model that we've since replicated, serving hundreds of millions of additional meals to Texas kids, all because of the work of these 2 Sunday school teachers at Southland Baptist Church in San Angelo, because they were committed to addressing an issue that was right in front of them. Yeah, that's right.
Also, when I read your book, I came away with the driving thesis that successful collaboration requires purposeful effort towards effective communication. So talk to us about the importance of effective communication and what that looks like across political lines and religious lines, racial lines, and geographic lines.
Well, I'm hoping that my wife isn't watching this, because if she is, she knows effective communication is not my spiritual gift. But imagine this. Imagine if she and I were to go to a marriage counselor, and I told the marriage counselor that, she's not doing what I want her to do, and she said the same thing about me. And the marriage counselor said, well, if you would just shame your spouse publicly more often, then they would do exactly what you want. Well, of course, they'd probably lose their license if they did that. But for some reason, we think when we're trying to convince people to our cause or to our perspective, we think we need to be belligerent. We need to talk over them. We don't listen to a word that they say. And we oftentimes shame them publicly. And so I think the key to collaboration is building trust. And as Stephen Covey said, trust, leadership moves at the speed of trust, right? And so if we want to lead, we have to be able to listen. And we have to be able to listen so that we can build trust in communities, ultimately to move them towards collaborative efforts to address hunger.
And finally, you had the chance to meet liberation theologian Father Gutierrez once at Baylor. And he spoke into your life in a powerful way that shaped your life and your career. Could you briefly tell us that story and the power of commitment? Yeah,
Father Gutierrez has spent his life committed to people in poverty, and I was shortly out of seminary, and he was a hero of mine. And I asked him, I said, Father Gutierrez, how do you have solidarity with the poor? And he said, many people think that solidarity with the poor is oftentimes either imitating how they live or volunteering for a period of time with them. He said, but hunger and poverty weren't created overnight. They've been around for thousands of years. And so to think that we're going to end hunger or poverty overnight is an illusion. He said it's going to take us committing our life to their cause. He said, so solidarity with the poor is spending your lifetime committed to the cause of those who are hungry and poor. He's like, do that and you'll have solidarity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we need all hands on deck. All the collaboration, communication, commitment from people exactly like you. People who have borne witness to hunger and poverty at home and around the world, people on the front lines, people who care deeply about uplifting the world's poorest, and people who are advocates, people like you who are willing to lend their voices and take a stand for those who are suffering from hunger. The first sustainable development goal on the slide we showed earlier is to end poverty, and the two go hand in hand, ending hunger and ending poverty. Gandhi says that poverty is the harshest form of violence. And Jeremy argues in his book that hunger is the harshest form of poverty, which I really like that line in his book. We hope you'll join us in ending that violence of poverty and hunger. So what can you do? Quickly, you can read. We have free books for you, The End of Hunger, which came out last fall. We would love to give you at our booth at the 2030 Collaborative, and we're in booth number 3. At the same booth, Jeremy and I will be there after this. Jeremy has his books for free for you called I Was Hungry. So educating yourself on these issues of hunger and poverty, food security, and the prevention of treatment of severe malnutrition, and what you can do is just the first step. What's the second step?
Create a hunger-free community coalition in your community or participate in one. Go to hungerandpoverty.org and you can learn how to create one of these coalitions, download a free toolkit, and advocate. Oftentimes we think about talking to elected officials that we have to shame them or be belligerent, but the reality is that they oftentimes know a little about a lot. And so they don't know your issue like you know your issue. And so they need you to inform them so that they can make better decisions that affect both millions of Americans and millions of people around the world.
Absolutely. Ask them to simply protect or increase funding to fight severe nutrition, alleviating hunger for children worldwide. Let them know as medical missionaries on the front lines of hunger and as people of faith, you care deeply about the U.S. leadership to end hunger by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you.